Welcome, builders. So today we're going to be talking about CRUD. Create, read, update, delete. These are the four basic operations for data in an application. And today we're going to be looking at Entity Framework and how it integrates with MVC projects in ASP.NET through the use of scaffolding. Now, if you aren't familiar with MVC projects, check out Course 301. It gives the overall concept of MVC and then how that's implemented in ASP.NET. So for today, I figured we'd build a little sample application to illustrate the use of CRUD. And what that might be is, let's say we needed to build a web-based system to store student records. So we need to be able to create new students, we need to be able to read them or display them on the screen, we need to be able to update them, and then ultimately delete them. And with the use of Entity Framework and scaffolding, we can do that. We're going to be storing these student records in the database. So the first thing we're going to do is hop over to SQL Management Studio. I've got SQL running on my local, so we're going to store the students there. And then we're going to go into Visual Studio to create our model, and then use Entity Framework to link our models in Visual Studio with our table in SQL Server. So let's get started. All right, so here I am in SQL Management Studio, and I've got SQL running on my local. I have an empty database called Build Sharper University. So far it has no tables, so we're going to create a table. So let's do a new table. This is going to be the student table. So I'm going to need a student ID. Let's make that a type int. It doesn't allow nulls, and it will be an auto increment. Okay, we're going to need, let's say, a first name. We'll make that a varchar 255. Last name, varchar 255. And email. And we're going to save this table as student. Okay, so let me refresh our list of tables. So now that we've got our student table, I'm going to go and create a new query. Let's query this table. Select star from student. And we have no rows yet. But we're going to build an application to change that. All right, so here we are in our Visual Studio. I've created a brand new ASP.NET Core MVC project. The only thing I've added is our student model. So let's open up models, look at student, and we can see I've got a student class that mirrors the table we just created in SQL. So remember, we had the student ID, first name, last name, and email. Well, we have these same properties, and this way we have a link between our code and our data source, which is SQL Server. This will pass the data back and forth between the two. Real quick, the first thing I did when creating this new project, I went into Manage NuGet Packages and added Entity Framework Core. So that NuGet package gives us the ability to work with Entity Framework. Okay? So now that we have our student class, you can see this attribute over the student ID where we label this as a key. Okay? And that essentially just means it's the primary key for that table. Now, we have our class for our student, but it still doesn't have a way to talk to the database. This is done through a DB context. So you can see below we have a student context class. This inherits from DB context, which is a type in Entity Framework. So within this, we're essentially declaring our record set, or what they call a DB set. So we have a DB set, which is, you can think of it as a list of data. Okay, so this is a list of students, or a DB set of students, which is the same class we have defined here. So we have this set of students. We're going to call it student, and that's because of the naming convention in SQL. There's a few different philosophies out there. I guess I'm old school, but sometimes you'll see databases with pluralized table names. I like the singular table names because to me, a table name represents an entity. So one entity would be a student, not students. But again, there's lots of different theories out there on best practices. This just happens to be what I use and works for me. Now, the next part, this on configuring, it's actually wiring it up to SQL Server. And we can see we have this connection string where it's pulling from this app settings.json. So let's take a look. So in our app settings JSON, we've added a new section called connection strings. This is a specialized property that knows this is where we're going to pull connection strings. And I've created a new connection string which points to our Build Sharper University database. So now that we have our table in SQL and we have our model in Visual Studio, along with that DB context which allows the two to communicate. Now here's where the magic happens. Let's use the scaffolding to generate our controllers and our views. So I'm going to go into Controllers, Add New Controller. I'm going to select MVC Controller with Views using Entity Framework. Okay. My model class is going to be of type student. My data context is going to be the student context, as we saw. And I'm going to call this the student's controller. We're going to add. And right now it's generating all that code. So it has everything it needs to create our CRUD pages. It's creating the back-end code as well as those front-end views for the create, read, update, and delete. Okay, so let's expand controllers and take a look. We have this new student's controller. So if I look at my methods here, I have a get, so I can, on the index page, go retrieve a list of students. I can do a detail, so by ID, I can view the detail on a single student. That would be our read. We have a create. And again, we have another create here where we can pass in that data as a part of the post. So for example, if the user is presented with a form to create a new student, they're going to enter the ID, first name, last name, email, and it's going to post that back to the controller where it can create the record. That's what this method is for here. Okay? Then we have an edit. That's the update in CRUD. And we have our delete. So let's run it and take a look. So before we run it, there is one last thing we have to do. So in our program CS, we essentially need to have our program be aware of our student context that we created, because it gets injected into that student controller. If we go back to this controller, we can see in the constructor, it's taking in a student context. This will compile because it can find all the types, but at runtime, it's not going to know where to find that unless we add it to our program CS. So let's go do that. Program CS, I'm going to do a builder.services.addTransient, and we're going to give it type student context. Okay? Now, let's run it and take a look. All right, so we can see our Build Sharper University site is up. And this is the default page, but we need to go over to that students controller that we created. So in the address bar, I'm going to go to our localhost /students, because again, the students controller is the new controller we created, but /students is that index within that controller. So let's start there. Let's go to /students. And we can see this is our index page. We've got our properties, the first name, last name, and email for each student, but we don't have any records. So let's create a new one. Create new. We'll call this Fred Smith. Fred.smith@email.com. Okay? And now we have a record in our database. So to prove that, let's hop back over to SQL and take a look. So our old query is still here, where we're doing a select star from student, and we had 0 records returned. Well, now that we just entered it in our application, let's run it again here. And there we go, Fred Smith, fred.smith@email.com. So it worked. We just built an application that talks to SQL Server using Entity Framework scaffolding. So that covers the C in CRUD. We can now create records. Let's take a look at the R for the reading. So back in our app, we can look at the details, and essentially this is the read. So it's pulling up a single record. So in our query string, it's asking for student details 1, which is the first record, and then it's doing a read on that data. Okay, so now we've got create, read. Now for the update, I can click edit. And let me change this name to Sally. Okay, and we're going to change the email address as well to Sally Smith and save. Now let's go back to SQL. And I'm going to run this query one more time. And I can see in the database she was updated as well. Now Sally Smith at email.com. So now the last thing we got to do is D, which is to delete the record. So back in our application, we can click delete and confirm. We've got no more records here. And finally, let's check it in SQL. Run this query. No more rows. And that's it. See how quick and simple that was? Entity Framework is extremely powerful. We were able to build an application to house student records with creating, reading, updating, and deleting students in a matter of minutes. This is really powerful stuff. And it's actually why Entity Framework is my favorite data access layer to use when talking to SQL. And with MVC and scaffolding, it's really ideal for rapid application development. So, it's now time for everybody's favorite segment, homework. So I want you guys to create a blog, and you can use the same steps we just covered in this video. You can download SQL Express for free, so you can have that database running locally. Create the database, create your, maybe you could call it a post table to have like your post ID, your title, your body, the date published. You could house that in SQL. Then on the Visual Studio side, you'd have your model for a post. You'd have your post context to link the two, and then use scaffolding to generate your pages. And then for extra credit, create a new page to list out your blog post. So the scaffolding generates kind of that admin view where you can do all your CRUD operations. But from the user's perspective, they just want to read your blog. So there'll be a new listing page just to show each blog post from your database. So that's it. Happy CRUDing. We'll see you next time.